slavery, about freedom, about liberty, about democracy, about the republic, about all of this. And we're so pleased to welcome once again to the Rainbow Push family, because you are now family, DePaul University professor Dr. Thomas Makaitis. Our senior vice president and the senior pastor of the Douglas Memorial Community Church in Baltimore, Maryland, Reverend Dr. Todd Yeary, soon to be attorney Todd Yeary. Our national spokesman, need I say more? The Reverend in waiting, Jonathan Luther Jackson Sr. And what can one say about this icon, this human being who has stood on the battlefield? In fact, someone in a Huffington Post article said he's the most consequential politician in the history of America. More consequential than George Washington even, because he's navigated these streams, not just as a freedom fighter, but as a descendant of American slaves, as a black man, the Reverend Jesse Louis Jackson Sr. Reverend, why don't you begin this conversation? Why don't you help us to frame it? Because you were so impressed. We've all been so impressed by what we saw in the New York Times, and as we've been seeing, they have sought to reframe the conversation about those who had been enslaved and taking us from being, as you said, we're not at the bottom, but we are the...
What captured my attention about this was a book Congressman Jackson wrote in 1991, I suppose, 30 years ago, A More Perfect Union, where he established that we were born not 1717, we were born 1619, a year before the Pilgrims got here. Now, if you don't, if that's not the birth, then you start at 1776. All the leaders are white men. America had been made wealthy by cotton and sugar by that time. We made America. We're the foundation, not the bottom. Reverend, what does I mean when I say foundation, not bottom?
The foundation, not the bottom, is to recognize that the experiment that has become known to the world as the United States of America has a complicated origin based on the denial of what the law calls a person. Trading in African bodies, which brings us to this 400-year marker of not only remembrance but responsibility, requires that we who have lived to tell the story must continue to remind the country that we are the foundation, not the bottom. I thought about this as we were talking about this panel. That's what your mantra, I am somebody, was actually tied to. That it is the self-declaration of personhood, not tied to someone else's recognition of me, but my recognition of myself. And so 400 years later, we who have survived the process of the denial of historical memory and economic relevance claim the moral authority to declare that we are somebody. And so that is, I think, for me, the foundation, the reminder that while we're continuing this struggle, and there's more to do, that we do it having in our mind's eye 400 years of resilience and resistance against a horrific inhumanity.
Dr. Thomas Makaitis, why is it important for us, particularly 400 years later, why is it important for us to reframe this conversation as so much in America is up for debate?
Any effort to promote social justice and inclusion has to not only fight the fight in the present, it has to reclaim the past. with an honest telling of truth about history. And what has happened is that we have preferred a celebratory, congratulatory, Eurocentric version of history that has either left out vast numbers of people entirely or relegated their story to a sideline. You heard it horrifically with Newt Gingrich saying, well, this is only the history of some of us. That's ridiculous. It's the history of all of us. There is a unified American history that this project is trying to reclaim and assert.
Jonathan?
To the question of the foundation, the Bible states in Genesis, in the beginning, that it's so important that you go back to the Genesis, to the origin. If not, you are doomed to repeat, and you don't understand what you have been through. Certain persons that may have a gene that is inclined towards alcoholism should know their parents' history so that you can stay away from that disease that you have. The same thing as those that have addictive personalities and across the board. So knowing your history, because it's closer to you than you can imagine. The other part is when they say reframing, I would simply use and tacitly make the challenge, we are now framing it correctly. That if it was broken and it was wrong, you have to rebuild it and tell the truth. The foundation does not change because it's the truth. And there's a way about truth, even though it's crushed to the earth, it shall rise again. And in 400 years, with the demographics that are changing in the United States of America, with the literacy increasing, with all of these forces converging, people are demanding the truth be told. So this is inevitable. And so on 400 years later, when we talk about the foundation, where did we come from? This is what Dr. Lerone Bennett had pushed for. This is what Dr. Carter G. Woodson had pushed for. But why couldn't we have had the 300th year celebration? Because 100 years ago today, blacks were getting lynched and no one was found guilty. We could not have that conversation. So now after 400 long years, we have enough education. We have enough access to books. We didn't have access to books until 150 years ago. And unfortunately, some of our schools still don't have books. So it's been a long journey. No other history and no other country on earth made it in part of their constitution on its birth, on its soil. Slavery embedded. People had slavery in colonies. They weren't born with a dual contradictory consistency of promoting freedom abroad and oppression at home.
Sandy, you know, one of the things that strike me so much, Jonathan talks a lot about the crack in the 13th Amendment laid the groundwork for all these prisons, and while we were talking about prisons doing it, John, explain the crack in the 13th Amendment.
Well, the first 12 amendments were made for the general population of white men and white women. And specifically, they call the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment the slave amendments because after 246 years of slavery, it had to be put back in the Constitution. The Constitution had to be amended to abolish slavery. But it's the shortest article in the entire Constitution. It says slavery is abolished, unless you have been duly convicted. That's on our books today. And what does that mean in 2019? That means if one of my relatives goes to jail and they have a kidney that can save my life, they are property of the Department of Corrections. You are not a citizen if you are in jail. That is in the Constitution, unless duly convicted. So when they convict you, that is why we have to fight the whole idea of over-criminalizing and putting these felonies on all of our children and family members. It invalidates your citizenship. Only citizens can vote.
So as we look at the remnants of not being able to vote, as we look at 33 million voters who have been purged from 2014 to 2018, 16 million between 2014 and 2016, 17 million between 2016 and 2018, what does that mean? Because we don't see a real movement to put voters on the books. And we also understand that the original idea of the framers of the Constitution, of the founding fathers, was not to have women to vote, was not to have poor people to vote. If you were a propertied white man, you were the only one who could vote. What does that mean?
Well, I think what was brilliantly said by the author of the opening essay in the 1619 Project, that that the story of American freedom is an ongoing thing. It was never completed. Women were excluded, people of color were excluded, all kinds of people, and they still are. And that we really are not, none of us are free. None of us are the nation we profess to be if any of us are in any way, shape, or form excluded. And that's what it's about. And I think it's brilliant that this is being linked to this whole discussion of this terrible emergence of the carceral state, the industry of imprisonment, which is also a source of profit and economic exploitation, not merely a denial of citizenship.
Dr. Lakaitis, is that not an extension of what, well, Reverend, isn't the profit in the prison industrial complex, is that not an extension of slavery?
It's an extension of the 13th Amendment. All are free except those who are in prison, which meant they were able to round up people and put them in jail. And they then became builders from jail. So we went from slave masters to segregation masters. And that's what Jonathan talked about for a long time, Jonathan, the Proshman in Mississippi.
They were, yeah, absolutely right. You could, using vagrancy laws, you would round people up, incarcerate them, and then essentially sell their labor to planters during the cotton harvest, to whatever you needed to get done. That's why historians refer to the post-Civil War era as the restructuring of slavery. Finding new ways to use the same exploitive things within that narrow umbrella of legality.
And I would like to add to that, look at the names. The names are all around us. When you think of Fort Sumter, and there's a Sumter County, South Carolina. Last week, I had the honor of standing in for my father, the Reverend Jackson, in Sumter County, Alabama. That Sumter, who started the Civil War, was a slave owner, slave master. When we talk about the Edmund Pettus Bridge, that's General Edmund Pettus, a renowned Ku Klux Klansman from the state of Alabama. When we talk about all of these gentlemen, Fort Bragg, he was a Klansman, and that's the name of a military base. People that were denied access to reading, denied access to writing. We never had the opportunity to tell our history. I have to give a very special thank you to Dr. Lonnie Bunch in having pioneered the African American History Museum. Why? It's not for African Americans. He put a vital piece of American history together. It was missing. American history has had propaganda and lies and distortion. This is why Dr. Carter G. Woodson founded African American History Month. He founded it right here in Chicago, not many blocks away. Why? Because by the time he went to Harvard and obtained his PhD, he started reading through all the documents and did not see any contributions of African Americans. So he said something is wrong. There was a deliberate deletion and distortion and denial to put our history in. We're just now learning our history. The last slave ship to come into America was the slave ship Clotilda down in Mobile, Alabama, and the founders of that created Africa Town. That ship was just now discovered within the last 2 years. So we are learning our history.
In the conversation about remembering the names, you mentioned names of forts, and like there are other names that we ought not forget. Thomas Jefferson, though he was one of the architects of our constitutional frame, was a slave owner. We have to remember that we tried to modify the relationship he had with his property, Sally Hemings, and then turned it into a movie miniseries and talked about the love affair between a grown man and a 12-year-old. So I want to make sure that when we're talking about revisionist history, revising the history is not just about rearranging the words, it's about rearranging the power dynamic behind them. And so 400 years later, remembering how we tell this story about how slavery emerged as the economic underpinning of the nation's emerging wealth at a time when we're having a conversation around reparations, restorative economic justice. The reason that is important is because if you go back and look at the ship manifests, you actually see the insuring of African bodies for a price that if the cargo was lost, the owner of the cargo would be compensated. And so we cannot miss this fact. It's not just talking about some arbitrary random period in history. The economic undergirding of the United States tied to labor. Adam Smith's economic treatise says the wealth of a nation is tied to land and labor. Well, what were we? We were the labor and we were denied the land. And after the Civil War, when there was a process of restitution in place, then you started to see the coercion necessary to take the land back, which has now led to what we see in its current form of the modern racial wealth gap.
What is being missed here? Because we're reading a good many stories about plantations that are now open for tourism. And we have a good many white families who are going to visit these plantations, and they are coming away very angered by what they're seeing. They're saying, "You're not giving me a good time. I feel put upon. You're not telling the story right. This is sad, and I'm not coming back. I'm very angry." What did we miss? Please.
As someone who's taught history for 30 years, I tell my undergraduates, part of my job is to make you uncomfortable with your assumptions, uncomfortable with your cherished ideas, and if you don't like that, take somebody else's class. Part of truth-telling is confronting unpleasant realities. And I think what I'm very disturbed by is seeing this effort to reinvent the glorious South, the glorious Confederacy, with statues and flags and things which perpetuate a terrible injustice and lie about what it really was.
Jesse did when he was in the Congress. He went around to all of the monuments, what was on the monument, and described how it was misleading to the public. July 4th is 157 years after slavery. We built the country. We made the cotton cane. We made sugar cane at that time. And so in some real sense, that's a false birth date. That's why Newt Gingrich reacted, Jonathan, because fact is, the birth date is 1619, not 1776.
So Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House and called one of the architects, historians, and brains of the right wing's thrust in American government. Let me say one thing about him. I heard that if you get a rock and you throw it into a pack of dogs, if you hear one of those dogs howl, what happened? That dog got hit. These facts and this truth hurts because it hits Newt Gingrich. These are undeniable facts. The bones in the graves corroborate the stories. The 12-year-old girl that some would say was Thomas Jefferson's mistress. If we were to update that to 2019, how would you feel about calling him a pedophile? If you were to update that to 2019, how would you feel about calling one of the founders a child molester? Now, when you say this, people will get angry with me. He did it. Don't get mad at the messenger. So, when our historian tells us you cannot sanitize history, you can't put enough bleach on it and enough Febreze in the air. If there's a stench, you have to take it out and tell the truth. So a lot of young children will be angry. Why? How would you feel if you came home one day after 21 years and you realized your mother and your father were not your real mother and father? You'd want to know who all lied to you and misled you. You would have a yearning in your soul to find out, who are my parents? Young African Americans are trying to find out who we are as a people. Why was our history denied? Why has it been destroyed? In closing, we just left Poland and Auschwitz and Birkenau. And there's a pattern that I've seen. After the Nazis had to leave, the last thing they did was try to bomb the sites to erase the memory. Go back and look at Diocletian and Constantinople in Turkey. They burned the libraries. Why have our cemeteries been covered up? Because you want to erase the history. But thank God that truth crushed to the earth is rising.
Santita, to your... Yeah, that's an important point, because to the point about, I think, well-meaning whites feeling put upon. They feel put upon because we start the conversation at the wrong historical point. If you feel put upon because of the plantation discussion, then let's go back. We talk about coming to Point Comfort on the White Line in 1619 with a cargo of African captives from what was then known as Angola. Let's go to Angola. Let's go to Ghana. Let me take you back to the slave dungeons where I would take my students when I was teaching at Northern Illinois University. And let's go to Elmina and Cape Coast. If you feel put upon about the plantation, let's walk through the remaining and ongoing stench in the walls of human excrement in the male holding cell. Let's stand at that space in the Dutch church that said Zion is the dwelling of God, and as they left to go to the ships, it was under the guise that they were being brought to Zion. Let's talk about the fact that when they were taken from their holding cells to the entries to the ship, that they went through a door called the door of no return. See, if we're going to talk about feeling put upon, before you feel like I've somehow assaulted you about your economic benefit, let's go back to the place where the suffering began. Let's go to Asan Manso in Ghana, where the last running, flowing body of water before they got to the coast was where many of the mothers either took their last bath or drowned their infant children to help them avoid the horror of what was coming. So if you want to feel put upon, I don't have a problem with that, but let's feel put upon for the right reason. So if the plantation makes you anxious, that's why 1619 is being reshaped as propaganda as opposed to truth, because truth requires a different confession. And if we're going to have a reparations discussion, it cannot be about 1776. Let's talk about it at its nexus and go back where you come away with the sensory understanding that you can still smell body fluids of people who gave their lives in the walls of the places where they were held. Once you've had that experience, then we can talk about you feeling put upon.
We've got about...
Jesse Jr.'s book, and more perfectly described this most clearly and vividly to me. We speak about reparations. Those who had slaves got paid to let us go. The slave masters got reparations. Jonathan, the slave masters got reparations for letting us go. Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr. is here today. We asked him to share something about his book and his sense of went around all those monuments across the South, and you changed the monuments. You got Freedom Hall in the U.S. Capitol because of your work today. You sum up what you've heard today, and when we go meet Congressman Jesse Jackson Jr.
Congressman? Okay, what we're going to do, we're going to bring out the podium so that Congressman Jackson can give his remarks, because he did write a book that I would urge you to get, A More Perfect Union. We only have about 20 minutes, not even, left, about 18 more minutes, and we want Congressman Jackson to have as much time as he needs. If you don't mind, Dr. Mikitis and Reverend Jackson, a minute apiece. Dr. Mikitis, would you give us a concluding remark?
I think this is one of the most, and I'm speaking as a professional historian, that this is one of the most exciting projects I've seen in a very long time. And there's no reason why anybody should feel threatened by it. We have got to get out of this mentality that if some group is somehow included or benefits, everybody else is somehow penalized. This is about completion, inclusion, about weaving back in an important thread in the fabric of the American story. It is not an attack on anybody else. A demand for inclusion and justice is not an attack on somebody else. It's just what it is, inclusion.
Reverend Jackson Jonathan.
Thank you, Dr. Mikitis. It's a difficult and arduous task to take people out of their own ignorance. And the worst part of ignorance is not what you don't know, it's what you think you know that's not true. We cannot heal ourselves as a nation and go forward until we confront our history. The worst part of ignorance is not what you know, it's what that you think that you know that's not true. My father asked me to repeat it. It's what you think you know that's not true. Why? Because it challenges your paradigm. It challenges your belief system. It rocks your world. Most of the persons that voted for a president or any elected official have about an 80% re-up chance on voting for them again. Why? Because we don't like to acknowledge when we're wrong. We like to think, I just needed more time to look at it just another way. It was coming around. They couldn't do it, but they want to do it. But you're lying to yourself. The leopard doesn't change its spots. American history has never been taught in its entirety. And what is the consequence of that that's very negative? Some people have a superiority complex, and others have an inferiority complex. So when you walk up, I remember, and I'm going to leave you with this story. When I went to undergrad at North Carolina A&T, I was a proud young man. I felt whole because I saw African Americans everywhere in engineering and in real estate and accounting and PhDs everywhere and in engineering, things that I had never seen or heard of in Chicago. But by the time I went to Northwestern University for graduate school in the business department, and they had a cultural night, and they told everyone to come forward and celebrate your culture, wear your native attire. And I saw the children there from Germany and from Holland, and I saw them from Italy, and people had on native clothes. I didn't know what to do. I felt naked and embarrassed. I had just come back from Africa some time before, so I had some Nigerian garments. I put them on. I knew they weren't symbolic of my culture, but I wanted to do something that gave me some pride. But then I had to come to realize all the wealth that I saw at Northwestern, how it had been bequeathed and bestowed. In the dorm that I was staying, some man had just given $10 million to put his name on the dorm. That could have transformed my entire university where I came from. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are just now coming unto ourselves. We have been denied the opportunity to know who we are. We know whose we are, but we did not really know who we are. And the challenge becomes to the white Americans to now learn your correct history. It's not on me, it's on us.